Between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, the histories of many of the states and cultures of Afro-Eurasia became even more interconnected because of the expansion of Islamic civilization. Created by Muslim warriors, merchants, and administrators, the vast Dar al-Islam, the abode or realm of Islam, became one of the most important economic, intellectual, and cultural structures anywhere in the world. It dominated the western half of Afro-Eurasia in the same way that the Tang dynasty in China dominated the eastern. The word Islam means submission, essentially submission to the will of Allah, the only God in this monotheistic religion. One who accepts the Islamic faith is a Muslim, or one who has submitted. The Islamic faith and the early cultural practices associated with it were influenced by the desert environment and Bedouin traditions of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is huge, over 1 million square miles in area, but most of it is desert. It is also technically its own continent because it is an independent tectonic plate that is pulling away from Africa, expanding the Red Sea as it moves and heading towards the Eurasian plate, forcing up the Zagros Mountains that separate Iran from Iraq today. In this harsh and arid region, agriculture is only possible at a few oases and coastal settlements. Yet nomadic Bedouin peoples had learned to prosper through trade, organizing themselves into fiercely loyal clan groups like the Enaza and Shama. A widely quoted Bedouin saying gives us some idea of how their loyalty system works. I against my brother and I against my cousin, and my cousin and I against the stranger. This outlines a hierarchy of loyalties and tensions that begin at the nuclear family level, then move up through the extended family, the clan, and eventually the entire linguistic and ethnic family of Bedouin. Arabia is surrounded on 3 sides by ocean, so it has always been strategically well placed to link into long-distance trade routes via maritime trade ports in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, but also by overland routes via Palmyra and Damascus to the Mediterranean. It was in Mecca, a city about 40 miles inland from the Red Sea coast, that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born about 570 CE. Both of Muhammad's parents died when he was 6, so he was raised by his uncle and grandparents. Muhammad was employed by and eventually married a wealthy widow named Khadija. By the age of 30, he was one of many successful merchants living in Mecca, where the people recognized many gods and where there were both Jewish and Christian communities. In his late 30s, around the year 610, Muhammad had a profound spiritual experience and became convinced that rather than the host of deities worshipped by some of his fellow Meccans, there was in fact only one all-powerful God named Allah, the Arabic word for God, and that recognition of other gods was wrong. Muhammad interpreted the visions he was experiencing as revelations from Allah delivered through his messenger, the Archangel Gabriel. Without necessarily meaning to found a new religion, he told his family and friends about these revelations, and by 620, a loyal group of followers had joined Muhammad's circle. As Muhammad recounted the messages he had received, some of his followers began to write them down. By the early 650s, these written texts had been compiled as the Quran, a word that means recitation. The Quran quickly became the holy book of Islam. In beautiful poetic writing, the Quran expounds Muhammad's understanding of Allah and his relationship to the world and all humanity. It has remained the definitive authority for the Islamic faith ever since. But the growing popularity of Muhammad's preachings brought him into conflict with the rulers of Mecca, both for political reasons and because Muslim monotheism offended the polytheistic Arabs. As tensions with Arab elites increased, some of his followers were forced to flee to Ethiopia, the first of several waves of Muslim migrants and conquerors that would move into the African continent. Eventually, the pressure became so intense that Muhammad and about 70 of his followers left Mecca and moved to the rival trading city of Yathrib, about 200 miles north of Mecca. Various Arab and Jewish clans living in the city soon converted to Islam, and Muslims later started referring to Yathrib as Medina, a word that means the city, but in this context means the city of the Prophet. This migration in 622, the Hijra, marks the year 1 of the Islamic calendar, and also the moment at which the spiritual visions experienced by Muhammad were transformed into a serious religious but also social and political movement. As the head of a growing society in exile, Muhammad organized his followers into a cohesive community called the Ummah, the community of the faithful. This was a society within a society with its own law code, social welfare system, educational institutions, and income. Muhammad personally led the Ummah in daily prayers and also in 3 major military confrontations with his enemies who sent forces from Mecca to try and destroy the Muslim community, including the 625 Battle of Uhud, in which Muhammad was injured. As an experienced merchant, Muhammad was able to organize successful commercial ventures and use the profits to support the Ummah and provide relief for widows, orphans, and the poor. It was while Muhammad was living in Medina that he began to refer to himself as the final prophet, through whom Allah would reveal his message to humanity. He accepted that Allah had sent other earlier prophets to earth, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and he held the Hebrew Scriptures and Christian Bible in high esteem. But Muhammad was the final prophet of Allah. As the Ummah grew in size and confidence, Muslims aggressively sought converts and engaged in a jihad or struggle to enlarge the size of their congregation and territories. By 629, Muhammad and the Ummah were powerful enough to return to Mecca, which they entered without battle, quickly replacing the Arab government with their own theocratic administration. The Arab elites now accepted Allah, and the Muslims destroyed the old pagan shrines and built mosques instead, buildings that sought to instill a sense of community where Muslims gathered for prayer. They did retain one old pagan shrine, the Kaaba, a cube-shaped building containing a mysterious black rock, which was transformed into a shrine to Allah that only the faithful could approach. Muhammad himself led the first pilgrimage, or Hajj, to the Kaaba, establishing the Hajj as an example for all devout Muslims. Muhammad's faith was based on 5 obligations, now known as the 5 pillars of Islam. The first pillar is that Muslims must acknowledge Allah as the only God and Muhammad as the last prophet. The second is that the faithful must pray to Allah daily while facing Mecca. The third obligation is that Muslims must fast during the daylight hours of the month of Ramadan. The fourth is that they must contribute alms for the relief of the poor. And the final pillar, following Muhammad's personal example, was that all Muslims must try and undertake the Hajj to the Kaaba in Mecca at least once in their lives. As with most world religions and associated law code, the Sharia law later emerged to offer the faithful guidance on all aspects of daily life. The Sharia was inspired by the Quran and compiled by religious experts. It offered precise guidance on a range of social, political, and economic behaviors, such as marriage, inheritance, slavery, business dealings, and crime. It was partly because of the comprehensiveness of the Sharia that Islam became more than a religious doctrine, but a way of life with a complete set of social and ethical values. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, a substantial part of Arabia was under Muslim control. The Prophet was buried in Medina, and his advisors selected one of his closest disciples to serve as caliph, or civil and religious head of the Muslim state. The question of Muhammad's succession remains, however, one of the most controversial in all Islam. According to Sunni tradition, the first caliph was Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, who was recognized as head of state, military commander, chief judge, and chief religious leader. A prime example of the evolution and consolidation of secular, spiritual, and legal power during the era of agrarian civilizations. Under Abu Bakr and his successors, the jihad continued. After conquering the remaining non-Muslim tribes of Arabia, Muslim armies turned northwards to confront the huge but now somewhat complacent Byzantine and Sasanian empires. The lightning-fast expansion of the Dar al-Islam was unprecedented, even during an era in which many great empires grew rapidly to enormous size in their search for tribute and land. By 637, just 5 years after Muhammad's death, Syria, Palestine, and all of Mesopotamia had fallen. During the 640s, much of North Africa was incorporated into the Islamic realm. And by the time the Sasanian imperial heartland of Persia fell to the Muslims in 651, the Dar al-Islam stretched from the Mediterranean to Afghanistan. After a period of political consolidation, Islamic armies resumed the jihad early in the 8th century. Several kingdoms of northern India were conquered in 711, and Muslim hegemony in North Africa was extended to Morocco and then across the Straits of Gibraltar and into Spain by 718. In an era characterized by substantial civilizations, the Islamic realm had expanded in less than a century to be the largest civilization the world had ever seen. Despite the successful expansion of Islam, disagreements over Muhammad's succession led to a fateful split between the Shia and Sunni versions of the faith. Those followers who became the Shia had favored the appointment of Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law by marriage, Ali, as the Prophet's successor, instead of Abu Bakr. Ali did later serve as caliph, but his reign was plagued with bitter division. His assassination in 661 infuriated the followers, who thereafter organized themselves into the Shia, a word that means party, which adopted different doctrinal interpretations of Islam and remained fervently opposed to the traditionalist Sunnis. These political and spiritual differences have continued for almost 1400 years and remain a source of great tension within the Islamic world in the 21st century. While the split was occurring, Islamic authorities were faced with the same challenges that the Akkadians, Persians, Romans, Mauryans, and Han before them had been forced to confront: how to effectively administer a vast multicultural empire. The solution they came up with was to establish an administrative structure known as the Caliphate, which was consolidated under a relatively stable dynasty, that of the Umayyads, who ruled from 661 to 750. Their successors were the Abbasids, who provided another period of stable rule that lasted almost 500 years until 1228. The Umayyads were wealthy Meccan merchants, although they chose the Syrian commercial capital of Damascus as their capital. They were generally able administrators, creating the first Islamic currency based on a dual gold-silver standard and organizing regular tax collections. But their excessive focus on the heartland of their empire meant that they neglected the far-flung realms of the Islamic world. The Umayyads officially allowed people to follow their own religious beliefs, but they placed enormous pressure on conquered peoples to convert to Islam by levying a special religious tax, the jizya, on non-Muslims. During the 8th century, the Umayyad caliphs became increasingly aloof, eventually losing the support of all sectors of the realm, including the Arab military aristocracy. In the 740s, a powerful coalition of Sunnis and Shias, including Persian converts, emerged, and under the leadership of Abu al-Abbas, a descendant of Muhammad's uncle, the Umayyad royal clan was virtually annihilated at the Battle of Zab in what is now Iraq in January 750. The Abbasid dynasty then assumed control of the Islamic world and ruled the Dar al-Islam until it was destroyed by the Mongols in 1258. The Abbasids learned from the cultural exclusivity of the Umayyads and instituted a more cosmopolitan form of government in which power and administrative responsibilities were shared more equitably between Arabs, Persians, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians. They adopted Persian government practices and ruled from their magnificent purpose-built capital at Baghdad in present-day Iraq, leaving governors in control of the provinces. The Abbasids employed a large army and a sophisticated bureaucracy, put in place an efficient postal service, and maintained the superb road infrastructure that Islam had inherited from the Sasanians. The extreme west of the empire, the lands that are today Morocco and Spain, was left in the hands of a branch of the Umayyads, while other regions of North Africa never quite submitted to the Abbasids. The eastern parts of the realm, which are today eastern Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan, played a role in assisting the Abbasids to power, but moved gradually towards local autonomy. With a steady flow of tributary revenue coming in from all over the Islamic world, Baghdad was beautified with magnificent buildings, mosques, and squares, and became one of the great commercial, financial, industrial, and intellectual cities of the world. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 766 to 809, was a lavish patron of the arts and presided over a stable and wealthy realm. Harun enjoyed diplomatic exchanges with leading European rulers and famously sent a gift of a clock to Charlemagne, ruler of the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne and his companions had never seen a clock before and believed it must have magical powers because of the strange ticking and whirring sounds it made. The 9th century Muslim historian Muhammad al-Tabari claimed that when Harun al-Rashid died, the treasury at Baghdad contained 900 million dirhams, an immense fortune. In the vast region now controlled, if loosely, by the Abbasids, millions of people converted to Islam and enriched the Islamic realm by bringing into it their own cultural traditions. Muslim administrators and intellectuals adapted many of these traditions for their own purposes, particularly cultural and scientific ideas. This cultural and linguistic synthesis resulted in an explosion of intellectual activity throughout the Muslim world in a period historian Frederick Starr has called the Lost Enlightenment. Although Arabic was now the lingua franca, Persian became the principal language of literature and law. Perhaps the most famous Persian Islamic literary masterpieces that resulted are the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and the Tales of the 1001 Nights. The establishment of formal educational institutions facilitated this great age of learning. Mosques maintained their own schools, supported by wealthy Muslim merchants, and by the 12th century, centers of higher learning known as madrasas had been established all over the Muslim world, supported by rulers who needed literate, educated men to run their bureaucracies. An inscription above the entrance of the great Ulugh Beg Madrasa in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, a glorious building I've had the good fortune to enter on several occasions, gives us some idea of how Islam encouraged education. It reads, "To strive for knowledge is the duty of every Muslim." In this intellectual environment, many of the great literary and scientific works that had been produced by more ancient peoples were translated and incorporated into the Islamic cultural realm. Indian mathematics were particularly attractive to Muslim scientists and merchants because the Indian numerals were just far more flexible than the Roman. Try multiplying 99 by 11 rather than XCIX by XI and you'll see what I mean. These Hindi numerals simplified bookkeeping and were adopted by Islamic merchants from whom they spread to Europe and later became known as Arabic numerals. Islamic intellectuals were also deeply impressed with the literature and scientific achievements of the classical Greeks, and the works of Plato and Aristotle were soon translated into Persian and Arabic. One of the greatest of all Islamic intellectuals was Ibn Rushd, who served as a senior administrator of Muslim Seville in the mid-12th century. Ibn Rushd is best known as Averroes in the West, and his attempts to reconcile the Islamic faith with the rational view of the world articulated by Aristotle was influential on the emergence of scholasticism in places of higher learning in Western Europe. Scholasticism, in similar fashion, attempted to reconcile Christianity with Aristotelian thought. With all of Central Asia and the Middle East now under the control of the Muslims, regions that for centuries had been divided among different political powers, an economic golden age also ensued. Under the Abbasids, agriculture thrived in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia during a period sometimes called the medieval Green Revolution. It was an era of increased productivity and population growth that stimulated the economy of the region like never before. Increased agricultural output was achieved by the expansion and better maintenance of the ancient irrigation canal systems, some of which had been in place in Mesopotamia for 4,000 years by this stage, and also by the introduction of new methods of fertilization and crop rotation. As Islam spread further east and south into India, Islamic administrators discovered new and useful crops that were transplanted throughout the Dar al-Islam in a generally east to west direction, from India to Persia, and then on to Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean. The most important of these transplants were sugarcane, rice, sorghum, wheat, spinach, artichokes and eggplants, oranges, lemons and limes, bananas, coconuts, watermelon, mangoes, and cotton. These transplanted species led to a richer and more varied diets across the Muslim world, and also increased the amount of food available because they effectively extended the growing season. Commercial activity also flourished across the Islamic world. Muhammad himself had been a merchant, and under the Abbasids, elaborate trade networks linked all the regions of the Dar al-Islam together, connecting them to an even larger Afro-Eurasian-wide network. Camel caravans facilitated this, leading to the establishment of thousands of new caravanserais. The production and trade along trans-Saharan and Central Asian exchange routes of industrial crops like cotton helped fund the Abbasid Golden Age. And of course, maritime trade also prospered after Islamic sailors adopted Chinese innovations like the compass. Muslim sailors and their ships linked East and Southeast Asia to the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the coast of East Africa in a thriving commercial network. Whether by land or sea, trade also benefited from the sophisticated Muslim business organization. Islamic law facilitated honest transactions, and Abbasid businessmen pooled their resources in group ventures. Improved transportation infrastructure and more sophisticated banking practices further contributed to this surge in commerce. Although territorial expansion of the Dar al-Islam continued under Abbasid leadership, it did so less because of official Abbasid policy and more as a result of campaigns carried out by regional Muslim forces, like the semi-independent Saracens in the Mediterranean or the conqueror Mahmud of Ghazni in India. A significant yet not widely known battle was fought early in the Abbasid Caliphate between Islamic and Tang Chinese forces in 751, deep in the heart of Central Asia. During the 5-day Battle of the Talas River, a large Muslim force struggled to overcome a smaller Chinese army for control of the important Siadaiya Valley. The Chinese forces were eventually overwhelmed, marking the end of westward Tang expansion and opening up much of Central Asia to Muslim penetration, leading to the further spread of Islam amongst the Turkic-speaking peoples of the region. Legend has it that amongst the Chinese captives were 2 papermakers, and this is how the craft of papermaking was introduced into the Islamic world. The Dar al-Islam had a significant influence on the lives of women within its borders, and its customs affecting women also appear to have been influenced by some of the cultures it absorbed. As Muslims expanded their faith out of Arabia, they took control of regions of Afro-Eurasia that had long histories of patriarchy. These ancient cultural practices and social structures went on to profoundly influence the Islamic worldview. The veiling of women had been a common practice in Mesopotamian societies for millennia, for example, and upper-class women had long been confined to their homes, only permitted to move about in public, veiled and in the company of male chaperones. Concerned about ensuring the genealogical purity of their offspring, Muslim men quickly adopted this practice and enshrined it in Islamic law. Yet it remains a point of contention as to whether the increasing levels of patriarchy that emerged in later Islamic society were a product of the Islamic faith itself or of its incorporation of the more rigidly patriarchal structures that it absorbed. The sacred books of Islam, particularly the Quran, did have much to say about the role and status of women in Islamic society. But what emerged in the Dar al-Islam was clearly a synthesis of core Islamic and borrowed ideas that continues to influence Islamic society to the present day. It is also difficult to be definitive about the status of women in pre-Islamic Arab Bedouin society. Some evidence suggests relative equality, citing the example of Muhammad's own wife, the successful merchant Khadijah. Yet other practices, such as the acceptance of female infanticide and unlimited polygamy, suggest that Bedouin society was rigidly patriarchal. The Quran offers a mixed view of the status of women under early Islam. Women are often portrayed as honorable companions, not property. Muhammad appears to have been kind and respectful to his own wives, as this extract from Muhammad's last sermon suggests. O people, it is true that you have certain rights with regard to your women, but they also have rights over you. Remember that you have taken them as your wives only under Allah's trust and with His permission. If they abide by your right, then to them belongs the right to be fed and clothed in kindness. Do treat your women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers. The Quran also outlaws female infanticide and urges that the payment of dowry should be made to the wives, not to their husbands, giving women the right to manage the wealth they had brought into the family. Marriage was regarded as a contract in which the wife's consent was imperative. Because of these practices, some gender historians argue that Islamic law gave women considerable rights compared to those of many other contemporary societies. Yet other historians point to the clearly patriarchal nature of different elements of Islamic law, which attempt to strictly regulate the sexual and social lives of women, and also allow men to take up to 4 wives, while women were permitted only 1 husband. Some elite women did play a semi-public role in the caliphates, particularly in education. Fatima al-Fikhri is remembered as the founder of the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in present-day Morocco in 859 CE. And in Damascus in the 12th and 13th centuries, some 26 mosques and madrasas were funded by women through charitable trusts. A handful of elite women also had access to high levels of education in the medieval Islamic world and earned degrees as scholars and teachers. Yet historians estimate that women accounted for at best only 1% of scholars by the 12th century, and their attendance at lectures was roundly criticized by conservatives. As was the case in many ancient societies, middle and lower class women often enjoyed a greater public role than elite women through their employment as farmers, construction workers, nurses, and moneylenders. The dyeing, spinning, and embroidery sectors of the textile industry were also monopolized by women. Female nurses were employed in many Muslim hospitals, and 2 women doctors are known to have served the Almohad Caliph Abu al-Mansur in the 12th century. But of course, the reason that female medical staff were needed was because men and women patients were strictly segregated in Islamic hospitals. As Islam continued into the modern era, these earlier practices were modified in some societies, but more strictly enforced in others. In many moderate Muslim nations today, women enjoy legal protections and freedoms similar to those of women in many Western nations. Yet in more traditional Islamic states, sex segregation and patriarchy are as rigidly enforced today as they were 1,000 years ago, perhaps even more so. In spite of all its benefits, the prosperity of the Abbasids tested their administrative abilities. Over time, local authorities in North Africa, Egypt, and parts of Syria and Central Asia took advantage of occasional weaknesses in central government to enhance their own power. The situation worsened after the death of Harun al-Rashid in 809. Civil war between his sons damaged Abbasid authority, and provincial governors assumed independent power and stopped paying their taxes to Baghdad. Despite the cultural and economic vibrancy of the Abbasids, by the end of the 9th century, their administration was on the brink of political disintegration. An additional critical factor in the dissolution of the Abbasid Caliphate might have been environmental. Climate evidence suggests that much of the Dar al-Islam experienced a period of significant cooling early in the 10th century, which led to a decline in agricultural production that the region took a long time to recover from. By about 900 CE, the appearance of new regional powers like the Tahirids and Samanids effectively ended any semblance of an all-powerful caliph in Baghdad. In the 10th century, Persian aristocrats took over the Abbasid throne, and during the following century, power passed into the hands of the Seljuks, a group of militarized Turkish nomads who had converted to Islam and now occupied much of the caliphate. Despite these political vicissitudes, for about 700 years, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates created a connective zone of trade, exchange, and communication stretching from India to the Pyrenees. Intellectual activity flourished, and new crops, agricultural technologies, and manufactured goods were spread by merchants across an enormous region of Afro-Eurasia, stimulating that world zone as never before. Any hope that this golden age of Islam would be restored was destroyed in the 13th century by the Mongols, who in many ways changed the world forever.